The Battle for Belmont Lane, a story of resilience and redemption. The autumn sun hung low over Belmont Lane, casting a golden glow across the manicured lawns and colonial-style homes of what was supposed to be my suburban paradise. I'm Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old senior software engineer at a Fortune 500 tech firm. After 8 years of grinding late nights coding, saving every dime, and navigating corporate boardrooms where I was often the only black face, I'd finally bought my dream home. A 3,200 square foot colonial at 1423 Belmont Lane. It was the kind of place you'd see on a postcard, with white shutters and a wraparound porch, nestled in a neighborhood I thought screamed respectability. That crisp October morning, dressed in my sharpest navy blazer and khakis, I stood in my driveway, keys in hand, ready to start a new chapter. But Belmont Lane had other plans for me, courtesy of its self-appointed gatekeeper, Linda Harris. The moving truck rolled in right on schedule, and I was directing the crew, carrying a box of my prized book collection. Yes, this black man reads, and I'm proud of it when I caught sight of her. Linda Harris, late 50s, blonde hair stiff from dye, emerged from the house across the street like a general inspecting her troops. Her arms were crossed, her lips pursed in that universal suburban scowl, the kind that says, something's not right here. She wore a blazer so crisp it could have doubled as a weapon and pants ironed to a razor's edge. I set down my box and flashed my boardroom smile, the one I'd honed in rooms full of skeptics. "Good morning," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Marcus Thompson, your new neighbor." Linda didn't even glance at my hand. She stepped back, eyeing me like I'd just offered her a ticking bomb. "I don't think so," she said, her voice dripping with that tone reserved for scolding dogs or, apparently, people she deemed out of place. "This is an exclusive neighborhood. Are you with the moving company?" And there it was, the gut punch. My MBA, my 6-figure salary, my 800 credit score, none of it mattered. To her, I was just a black man who didn't belong. I kept my smile steady, my voice even. "No, ma'am. I'm the homeowner. Just moved in today." I gestured toward my house, keys jingling. "Beautiful neighborhood you've got here." Her face cycled through shock, disbelief, and finally landed on something I can only call righteous fury. "That's impossible," she snapped, as if her will could rewrite my deed. "The Thompsons would never sell to—" She stopped, but we both knew how that sentence ended. "To what?" I asked, letting a hint of steel creep into my tone. "To someone who can afford it?" Linda's face turned crimson, and she whipped out her phone like she was calling in an airstrike. "We'll see about this," she muttered, speed dialing her reinforcements. The movers, God bless them, pretended not to notice, but I saw their glances. They'd seen this before. I went back to unpacking books, diplomas, picture frames, each item a quiet defiance of her assumptions. Linda, though, wasn't done. She planted herself on my lawn, pointing at me while barking into her phone. "Yes, he claims he owns the house," she said, loud enough for the whole block to hear. "How do we know he's not lying? People like that will say anything." 20 minutes later, her cavalry arrived. Enter Ronald Harris, Linda's husband and the neighborhood's resident power trip. Ronald wasn't just any Kofi, was the kind who wore his badge like a crown. Pulling up in his patrol car, he hit the siren for a dramatic 3 seconds, as if my moving truck was a national security threat. At 5 feet 9 inches with a donut-fueled gut and a scowl that looked permanent, Ronald carried himself like he was untouchable. "What's the problem here?" he barked, not even looking at me, addressing Linda like I was invisible. Linda gestured wildly. "This man claims he owns the Thompson house, but something's not right, Ronald. Check his ID, run his name, something." Ronald finally turned to me, his eyes narrowing as he took in my suit, the moving truck, the house. You could see the gears turning, but instead of reason, he doubled down on suspicion. "Sir," he said, hand on his belt near his radio, "I need identification and proof of residence." I could have lost it right there. I could have shouted about my rights, about racial profiling, about how he had no grounds to demand anything. But I've learned a thing or two in my 34 years. Sometimes, you play the game to expose how rigged it is. "Of course, officer," I said, slowly pulling out my wallet. "But I'm curious, what's the legal basis for this request? Am I suspected of a crime?" His jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned. "We've received reports of suspicious activity," he said. "I'm investigating." "Suspicious activity?" I repeated, handing over my driver's license and closing documents. You mean moving into my own house? Ronald scrutinized the papers like a detective on a crime show, while Linda stood 10 feet away, tapping her foot, waiting for me to be exposed as a fraud. The movers had stopped working, their phones out, filming what was clearly about to go viral. Ronald grudgingly admitted, "This address matches," but then added, "How do we know these documents are legit?" That's when I stopped playing defense. "Officer Harris," I said, reading his name tag, "do you extend this scrutiny to all new residents, or just the ones who don't look like your usual neighbors?" His face reddened, but before he could respond, I heard it. "Don't take that tone with me, boy." He said it. In 2024. On camera. While wearing a badge. The word hung in the air, toxic and heavy. I didn't flinch. Instead, I pulled out my phone. "Could you repeat that, officer? I want to make sure I got it right for the recording." Ronald's face went from red to purple. He hadn't noticed I was recording, and the weight of his words was sinking in. "Turn that phone off," he demanded, stepping closer. "You're interfering with a police investigation." "What investigation?" I asked, holding my ground. "The one about whether black people can own homes here." Linda, silent until now, jumped in with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "Ronald, just arrest him already. He's trespassing and belligerent." Trespassing? On my own lawn. The irony was thicker than the October air. "Ma'am," I said, turning to Linda, "you're the one trespassing. That's my grass you're standing on. The sidewalk's 6 feet behind you." She looked down, realized I was right, and instead of stepping back, stepped forward. "I'll stand wherever I want," she snapped. And then it happened, her hand hit my chest, hard enough to make me stumble. Before I could react, Ronald shouted, "He assaulted my wife." I didn't touch her. I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I smiled. "Gentlemen," I called to the movers, still filming, "did you catch that?" "Every second, boss," replied James, the crew chief. "Including her assaulting you and him accusing you of assault." Ronald, not learning his lesson, turned on the movers. "You boys stop filming and mind your business," he said, hand still on his weapon. James, 6 feet 4 inches and built like a linebacker, didn't budge. "We're on private property with the owner's permission. We're filming for insurance purposes." That's when Ronald made his fatal mistake. "You're all under arrest for interfering with a police investigation," he declared, reaching for his cuffs. But before he could act, a second cruiser pulled up. This wasn't his backup, it was Captain Elena Martinez, his supervisor, responding to multiple calls about an officer causing a disturbance. She stepped out, her presence commanding, her eyes scanning the scene with the precision of someone who'd earned her rank through competence, not entitlement. "Officer Harris," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "What's the situation?" Ronald straightened, sweat beading on his forehead. "Suspected trespassing, Captain. This individual claims to own the property, but he's black, so you assumed he was lying?" Martinez interrupted, glancing at the documents in Ronald's hand. "Did you verify his ID and ownership papers?" "Yes, but any discrepancies?" "No, but his attitude." Martinez turned to me. "Sir, I'm Captain Martinez. I apologize for this. Can you explain what happened?" I laid it out: Linda's confrontation, Ronald's threats, the boy comment, Linda's shove, the mover's footage. Martinez listened, her face unreadable. When I finished, she turned to James. "You witnessed this?" "Every bit," he confirmed, showing her the video. Martinez watched it twice, her expression darkening. Then she turned to Ronald. "Officer Harris, you're relieved of duty pending investigation. Badge and weapon now." Ronald's face went white. "Captain, you can't. You called a black homeowner boy in uniform, harassed him on his property, and threatened witnesses. Do you understand the liability you've created?" Linda, not one to stay quiet, chimed in. "My husband was protecting this neighborhood from a homeowner moving in." Martinez snapped. "Ma'am, you assaulted this man on his property. You're both lucky he's not pressing charges." But Linda wasn't done. As Martinez cuffed Ronald, Linda kicked over a box of my books, scattering a first-edition Hemingway collection across the driveway. "Now you have a reason to call the police," she shouted. I looked at my ruined books, my composure cracking for the first time. But James stepped in. "Ma'am, you just committed destruction of property in front of a captain and cameras. Keep going." Martinez, already done, turned back. "Mrs. Harris, You're under arrest for destruction of property, harassment, and assault." Linda, in a final act of desperation, tried to bolt across my lawn, only to trip over a sprinkler and faceplant into my mulch bed. The movers couldn't hold back their laughter. Even Martinez cracked a smile as she cuffed Linda, now covered in dirt, still ranting about her rights. As both Harises were loaded into separate cruisers, I stood in my driveway, surrounded by my scattered belongings, shaking my head at the absurdity. As the police cruisers pulled away with Ronald and Linda Harris in tow, I stood in my driveway, picking up the scattered pages of my Hemingway collection. The October sun still shone, but the warmth felt hollow after the morning's chaos. Captain Elena Martinez approached me, her expression a mix of professionalism and genuine regret. "Mr. Thompson," she said, handing me her card, "I can't apologize enough for what happened. This isn't who we are as a department or a community." I nodded, kneeling to gather my books. "I appreciate that, Captain. But is this kind of thing common with Officer Harris?" Her pause was telling. "There have been complaints before," she admitted. "They weren't taken as seriously as they should have been. That changes today. The movers, led by James, helped me collect my belongings." "Boss," James said, holding up his phone, "this is going to be all over social media by tonight." He was already uploading the footage, titled "Racist Cop" and HOA Karen arrested for harassing black homeowner. I glanced at the screen, seeing the video racking up views. "Good," I said. "People need to see this." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "You sure you don't want to press charges? You've got a rock-solid case for assault and civil rights violations." I considered it. Part of me wanted the Harises to face every consequence, but another part knew the court of public opinion could be just as brutal. "Let me think about it," I said. "Right now, I just want to move in." By evening, I was settled in my new home, but Belmont Lane was buzzing. Neighbors who'd watched the drama unfold started approaching, some with apologies, others with cautious welcomes. Mrs. Lee, my next-door neighbor, brought over a tray of homemade dumplings and said, "I'm so sorry you had to deal with them. They've been a problem for years." The Johnsons, 2 doors down, shared stories of Ronald pulling over their teenage son for walking suspiciously in his own neighborhood. It was clear the Harises had been terrorizing anyone who didn't fit their narrow vision of Belmont Lane's standards. The video James posted exploded online, hitting 50,000 views by nightfall. Comments ranged from outrage to support, with a few predictable defenses of the Harises' behavior. But the real surprise came when I got home from dinner and found a legal document taped to my door. It was a cease and desist letter from the law offices of Carlton, Hayes, and Associates, signed by one Edward Carlton, Linda's brother-in-law. The letter demanded I remove the video, stop making defamatory statements, and pay damages for the Harises' emotional distress. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The document read like it was written by someone who thought bluster equaled legal weight. As a software engineer, I'm wired to think systematically, document everything, anticipate problems, solve them methodically. So while the Harises tried to intimidate me, I was already building a case. I started with social media, saving screenshots of the video's comments, shares, and early news articles picking up the story. Local TV stations reached out for interviews, and a civil rights group contacted me about using my case to highlight housing discrimination. Then I got strategic. I filed a complaint with the Belmont Lane HOA about Linda's trespassing and property damage, attaching the video as evidence. I lodged a formal complaint with the police department about Ronald's conduct, even though Martinez was already investigating, and I reported their misuse of emergency services to the city. The real goldmine came when I dug into Ronald's social media. For months before I moved in, he'd been posting about maintaining neighborhood standards and keeping out undesirable elements. His barely coded racist comments painted a picture of someone itching for a confrontation. 3 days after the incident, Edward Carlton called me, his tone far less aggressive than his letter. "Mr. Thompson," he said, all fake charm. "There may have been some misunderstandings Monday morning." "No misunderstanding here," I replied. "Your clients harassed me, assaulted me, and abused police power. It's all on video." He paused. Emotions were high. "Perhaps we can reach an accommodation." "What kind?" I asked. Another pause. "My clients will apologize and drop their demands if you don't pursue charges." That's when I knew I had them. "Here's my counteroffer," I said. They issue a public apology admitting their behavior was discriminatory. Ronald resigns from the police force. Linda steps down from the HOA board. They attend cultural sensitivity training at their expense and pay for my damaged property and legal costs. Non-negotiable. They have 48 hours. I hung up, confident I called their bluff. I didn't have to wait long. Ronald's career ended quietly. Martinez's investigation uncovered a trail of ignored complaints, harassment, profiling, abuse of authority stretching back years. Citizens came forward with stories that made my experience look tame. The police union tried to defend him, but when news stations aired his boy comment alongside his Facebook posts, they backed off. Ronald became a pariah in law enforcement overnight. Linda's fall was just as swift. The HOA demanded her resignation after other homeowners shared stories of her targeting minority families with petty violations. Their country club dropped them, their church suggested they find a new congregation, and their social circle collapsed. Edward Carlton called back within 24 hours. "My clients accept your terms," he said, his voice strained. Ronald resigned, citing personal reasons. Linda quit the HOA and her community roles. They issued a public apology in the local paper, a lawyerly non-apology full of regret for misunderstandings, but admitting their behavior was inappropriate and discriminatory. They paid for my damaged books and legal fees. I donated the punitive damages to local civil rights groups, turning their harassment into fuel for change. 6 months later, I was sipping coffee on my porch, watching Belmont Lane transform. The Harises' house had a for sale sign, empty for months because no one wanted the racist neighbor's property. The HOA, freed from Linda's grip, focused on real issues like community events and infrastructure. Mrs. Lee's solar panels inspired 3 other families to go solar, making our street nearly carbon neutral. The Johnson's son, Michael, became the neighborhood's tech guru, helping seniors with their devices. Potluck dinners, sparked by Mrs. Lee's dumplings, became a monthly tradition, with neighbors sharing dishes from their cultures. The video hit 2 million views, becoming a case study in sociology and criminal justice courses. I spoke at conferences about housing discrimination, my story featured in documentaries on modern racism and police accountability. Captain Martinez, now chief, implemented mandatory bias training and a civilian oversight board, using Ronald's case as a warning. The Harises, meanwhile, had moved 2 hours away. Ronald took a job as a mall security guard, and Linda became a substitute teacher. Rumor had it their new neighbors got anonymous letters about their history before they even unpacked. The internet, it seems, never forgets. But just as I thought the saga was over, life threw a curveball. One Tuesday morning in March, 18 months after the Harises left, I spotted a silver Toyota Camry creeping down Belmont Lane at 5 miles an hour. The driver was scoping out houses, lingering in front of mine for a full 5 minutes. My gut told me who it was before I saw her face. Linda Harris was back, and when her car pulled into the driveway of their old house taken off the market weeks earlier, without explanation, I knew they weren't just visiting. They were moving back. The sight of Linda Harris's silver Toyota Camry idling in front of my house sent a chill down my spine. It was March, 18 months since the Harises had slunk out of Belmont Lane, their reputations in tatters, their house unsold. I'd built a life here, morning coffee on the porch, barbecues with neighbors, a community that felt like family. But now, as moving trucks rolled into their old driveway at 1424 Belmont Lane, it was clear the Harises were back to reclaim their turf. I grabbed my phone and started recording, a reflex honed from our last encounter. Documentation, I learned, was my best defense. Over the next few days, I watched the Harises resettle with a mix of dread and fascination. Ronald looked like a shadow of his former self, gaunt, hunched, his swagger replaced by defeat. The man who'd once strutted around with a badge now shuffled like he was carrying the weight of his ruined career. Linda, on the other hand, had doubled down on her Karen persona. Her hair was shorter, blonder, styled like she was gearing up for war. She moved with the same militant precision, her eyes scanning the neighborhood like a hawk. The for sale sign was gone, replaced by their old lawn ornaments, as if they could erase the past 18 months. 3 days after their return, I found a letter in my mailbox, not a legal document this time, but a handwritten note on floral stationery that reeked of passive-aggressive menace. "Dear Mr. Thompson," it read in Linda's spidery script, We hope you've enjoyed your temporary reign as the neighborhood celebrity. Now that we've returned, perhaps it's time to discuss how we can coexist peacefully. We've learned from our past mistakes, and hope you have, too. Your neighbors, Ronald and Linda Harris. The phrase temporary reign hit like a slap. These people had lost everything: jobs, status, community, and still saw me as the problem. The delusion was almost admirable. I took the letter straight to Chief Elena Martinez, who'd been promoted after the Harris debacle. Over coffee at the station, she frowned at the note. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice steady but serious. "Ronald didn't just lose his job. He lost his pension, his benefits, his identity. Being a cop was all he had, and when it was stripped away, it broke him. Broken people do unpredictable things." She slid a file across the table, and my stomach turned. Ronald had been arrested twice in their new town, once for drunk and disorderly conduct after ranting about reverse racism in a bar, and once for harassing a Mexican family over their kids playing too loudly. Both charges were dropped on technicalities, but the pattern was clear. "He's obsessed with you," Martinez said. "He thinks if he can prove you were wrong that day, he'll get his life back. It's not rational, but obsession rarely is." Linda, meanwhile, was working a different angle. Mrs. Lee, my next-door neighbor, showed me screenshots from neighborhood Facebook groups I didn't even know existed. Linda, using a slightly altered name to dodge her infamy, had joined groups dedicated to protecting suburban values and fighting reverse discrimination. Her posts were a masterclass in dog-whistle racism articles about property values and crime stats, laced with comments that skirted outright bigotry but left no doubt about her intent. Worse, she was reaching out to homeowners, building a coalition of those concerned about Belmont Lane's changing demographics. She was careful not to repeat the explicit racism that had burned her before, but her message was unmistakable. She wanted the neighborhood white again. The scary part? She was gaining traction. A handful of longtime residents, those who'd moved to the suburbs to escape diversity, were nodding along at her community meetings. They weren't bold enough to confront me directly, but they were happy to whisper about traditional values behind closed doors. 3 weeks after their return, the first incident hit. I was planting roses in my front garden on a Saturday morning when I caught Ronald staring at me from his property line. He didn't speak or gesture, just stood there, his gaze heavy with malice. It wasn't illegal, but it was deliberately a silent threat. I ignored him, focusing on my roses, but he took my silence as a challenge. What followed was psychological warfare. Ronald started mowing his lawn at 6 a.m., the roar of his mower waking half the street. Linda filed petty HOA complaints against Mimi. Mailbox was non-compliant. My roses were too tall. They were testing me, trying to provoke a reaction. But I wasn't playing their game. Instead, I documented everything: photos of my compliant mailbox, measurements of my roses, timestamps of Ronald's early morning mowing. I shared it all with Chief Martinez, who assigned a patrol car to make regular passes through Belmont Lane. The neighborhood wasn't blind to this. Mrs. Lee, who dealt with Linda's passive-aggressive harassment over her solar panels, started keeping her own records. Dr. Priya Sharma, a professor who lived 3 houses down, took it further. She analyzed every HOA violation issued since Linda's return, cross-referencing them with homeowners' race and ethnicity. Her findings were stark. 100% of the violations targeted non-white families, despite us being only 30% of the neighborhood. It was a pattern of discrimination so blatant it could have been a textbook case. The turning point came from an unexpected ally. Mrs. Eleanor O'Connor, a 78-year-old retired teacher who'd lived on Belmont Lane for 40 years. White, Irish Catholic, and exactly the kind of person Linda assumed would back her traditional values. Eleanor was instead horrified. She showed up at my door one evening with a plate of oatmeal cookies and a manila folder. "I grew up in Boston during the 1950s, she said, her voice firm. "I saw neighborhoods poisoned by people like Linda Harris. I didn't move here to relive that." Her folder contained meticulous notes, written in shorthand from her teaching days, documenting Linda's private conversations at neighborhood gatherings. Linda had assumed Eleanor was a kindred spirit and let her guard down, admitting she wanted to clean up the neighborhood and teach Marcus Thompson his place. The quotes were damning explicit, unfiltered racism that left no room for misinterpretation. Dr. Sharma took Eleanor's notes and filed a federal civil rights complaint against Linda and the HOA, alleging violations of the Fair Housing Act and even RICO charges for coordinated harassment. The complaint sought punitive damages that could bankrupt the HOA if successful. But we weren't content with just legal action. We wanted to expose Linda publicly, in a way that would make her original humiliation look tame. The September HOA meeting was our chance. Word had spread that something big was brewing, and the community center was packed standing room only, with residents who hadn't attended in years showing up to see the showdown. Linda sat at the front table, clutching her property standards binder, confident she could spin the narrative. She was wrong. Dr. Sharma's presentation was a surgical strike charts showing every violation, comparisons to unsighted white homeowners with identical issues, and a clear pattern of racial targeting. The room grew silent as the evidence piled up. Then Eleanor stood, her teacher's voice cutting through the tension. "I'm reading direct quotes from Linda Harris," she announced, opening her folder. She read aloud Linda's words about undesirable elements, foreign cooking smells, and her plan to use violations to clean up Belmont Lane. The room erupted. Neighbors who'd been quietly uneasy now had proof of what they'd suspected. One by one, residents stood to share their own stories. The Johnsons recounted Linda's complaints about their son's suspicious walking. Mrs. Lee described years of harassment over her solar panels. The cascade of testimony painted a picture of systematic discrimination. Linda tried to deflect, claiming her quotes were out of context and her enforcement was about standards. But when Dr. Sharma asked why white homeowners with identical violations were never cited, Linda had no answer. The vote to remove her from the Property Standards Committee was unanimous. The vote to dissolve the committee entirely was just as decisive. And the vote to censure her and ban her from future HOA leadership passed with only 2 dissenting votes, hers and Ronald's. The September HOA meeting marked a turning point for Belmont Lane, but the fallout from that night was only the beginning. The room had erupted in a mix of outrage and vindication as Linda Harris's discriminatory campaign was laid bare. Dr. Priya Sharma's data-driven takedown and Mrs. Eleanor O'Connor's damning testimony had stripped away any pretense of Linda's neighborhood standards. But the Harrises weren't the type to go quietly, and I knew their return to Belmont Lane meant more trouble was brewing. What I didn't expect was how quickly their actions would lead to their final, spectacular downfall. The federal civil rights investigation, sparked by Dr. Sharma's complaint, moved with surprising speed. Within 3 months, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, concluded that Linda's pattern of HOA violations constituted clear violations of the Fair Housing Act. Their report recommended criminal charges for conspiracy to violate civil rights, citing her targeted enforcement against non-white homeowners. The HOA's insurance company, staring down potential liability in the millions, didn't even try to fight. They settled out of court, agreeing to financial compensation for affected homeowners, a complete overhaul of the HOA's governing documents, and mandatory fair housing training for all board members. The settlement was a victory, but it was the public unraveling of the Harrises that felt like justice. Linda's carefully curated comeback collapsed overnight. The neighborhood Facebook groups she'd used to rally her concerned residents turned against her. Screenshots of her private messages where she'd been far less guarded about her racial motivations circulated widely. Her attempts to play the victim, claiming reverse discrimination, fell flat against the mountain of evidence. Neighbors who'd once nodded along at her meetings distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her toxic agenda. Linda became a pariah, even among the conservative circles she'd courted. Ronald, meanwhile, was spiraling. The stress of the investigation, combined with his existing issues, pushed him over the edge. Chief Elena Martinez had kept tabs on him since his resignation, and her file on him grew thicker by the week. He'd been arrested twice more since returning to Belmont Lane, once for public intoxication after a rant at a local bar, and once for a screaming match with a black postal worker over a misdelivered package. Each incident chipped away at what little dignity he had left. But his final mistake was the one that sealed his fate. One night, under the cover of darkness, Ronald crept across the street to my driveway. My Tesla, a symbol of the success he seemed to resent, was parked there. I'd installed a security camera after their return, a precaution that paid off when it caught Ronald keying the word liar into the paint. The irony was almost poetish. Spent months trying to prove I didn't belong, only to provide undeniable proof that he was the one unfit for this community. I handed the footage to Chief Martinez, who added it to the growing list of charges against him. The vandalism charge was serious, but when prosecutors tied it to the federal civil rights violations and his history of harassment, Ronald faced real consequences. His public defender, clearly overworked and uninterested, negotiated a plea deal: 2 years in state prison and a lifetime restraining order barring him from coming within 500 feet of my property. Watching Ronald led away in handcuffs again was less satisfying than I'd expected. The man who'd once wielded his badge like a weapon was now a broken figure, his obsession with me costing him everything. Linda avoided criminal charges, but the civil consequences were brutal. She was personally liable for damages in multiple lawsuits filed by affected homeowners, including me, Mrs. Lee, and the Johnsons. Her reputation, already in tatters, was beyond repair. Even the most conservative social circles in Belmont Lane shunned her. The country club where she'd once held court sent a polite letter suggesting she not renew her membership. The charity boards she'd clung to for status restructured to exclude her. And their church, where she'd once led the women's group, gently asked her to worship elsewhere. Their house at 1424 Belmont Lane went back on the market, this time with a steep price cut. The listing agent, a friendly woman I'd met at community events, confided that selling it was nearly impossible. People Google the address, she said, shaking her head. The first thing they see is that viral video, then the news about the HOA case. Nobody wants the racist neighbor's house. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Harises had been obsessed with property values, yet their actions had tanked their own. As the legal and social consequences piled up, Belmont Lane was transforming into something beautiful. The diversity Linda had tried to suppress was flourishing. The Johnson's son, Michael, organized coding workshops for neighborhood kids, turning his suspicious walks into a badge of community pride. Mrs. Lee's solar panels sparked a green revolution, with 5 more homes going solar, making our street a model for sustainability. The monthly potlucks grew into block parties, where families shared dishes from their culture's: Korean kimchi, Jamaican jerk chicken, Indian biryani. The Diwali celebration that had once triggered Linda's complaints became an annual tradition, with lanterns lighting up Belmont Lane each fall. The HOA, under new leadership, rewrote its bylaws to include explicit anti-discrimination clauses and mandatory bias training. A civilian oversight committee was established to review complaints, ensuring no one could weaponize community rules like Linda had. My house became a gathering place, my porch a hub for neighbors who'd once been strangers. The framed cease and desist letter from Edward Carlton hung in my home office, a trophy of how quickly karma could work when you stood your ground. But the real victory wasn't just the Harises' downfall. It was the ripple effect. A young black couple, the Carters, bought a house 3 streets over after seeing my story online. They told me the video gave them the confidence to move to Belmont Lane, knowing it was a place where bigots faced consequences. Their arrival felt like a direct rebuke to everything the Harises stood for. My story had gone beyond viral. It was now a case study in housing discrimination, featured in documentaries and discussed at conferences. I'd been invited to speak at universities, sharing how one person's refusal to back down could spark systemic change. Chief Martinez, now a national figure for her reforms, credited my case with pushing her department to confront its blind spots. The sensitivity training the Harises were forced to attend didn't seem to stick. Rumors swirled that Ronald argued about reverse racism during sessions, while Linda complained it was anti-American. But their failure to change only underscored the neighborhood's progress. Belmont Lane wasn't perfect, but it was proof that communities could evolve when people chose courage over complacency. As spring rolled in, I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and watching kids play in the street. The Harises' house remained empty, the for sale sign fading in the sun. I raised my mug in a mock toast to their absence, whispering, "Thanks for the lesson in how not to be a neighbor." But even as I savored the peace, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. People like the Harises don't just disappear, they fester, waiting for a chance to strike back. I kept my cameras on and my documentation ready, knowing that vigilance was the price of living in a world that still had too many Lindas and Ronalds. The fading for sale sign across the street at 1424 Belmont Lane stood as a quiet monument to the Harisa's downfall. Spring had fully bloomed, painting the neighborhood in vibrant greens and pinks, and my morning coffee ritual on the porch felt like a victory lap. Belmont Lane had become everything Ronald and Linda Harris had fought to prevent: a diverse, vibrant community where neighbors shared meals, celebrated differences, and looked out for one another. My house at 1423 was no longer just a home. It was a symbol of resilience, a place where I'd stood my ground and helped rewrite the neighborhood's story. But the final chapter of this saga wasn't about the Harisa's defeat, it was about the legacy of what we'd built in their absence. The legal battles had wrapped up by early summer. The HUD settlement forced the Belmont Lane HOA to pay substantial damages to affected homeowners, including me, Mrs. Lee, the Johnsons, and the Carters, who'd faced their own share of petty violations after moving in. The funds covered my legal fees and the cost of repairing my vandalized Tesla, with the punitive damages donated to a local fair housing organization. The HOA's new bylaws, crafted with input from Dr. Priya Sharma and other residents, were a model of equity anti-discrimination clauses, transparent violation processes, and a community oversight board to prevent future abuses. The days of arbitrary enforcement were over. Ronald Harris was serving his 2-year sentence in a state prison an hour away. Word from Chief Elena Martinez was that he'd struggled to adjust, his obsession with clearing his name, alienating even the few inmates who'd initially tolerated him. Linda, meanwhile, was living alone in a small apartment in their new town, her teaching gigs drying up after parents complained about her history. Their social media presence had vanished, their accounts either deleted or abandoned after relentless online scrutiny. The house at 1424 remained unsold, a scarlet letter in real estate form. The listing agent told me buyers would pull up the address, see the viral video and news coverage, and back out. "It's like the house is cursed," she said with a wry smile. I couldn't help but agree. But the real story wasn't the Harisa's collapse, it was Belmont Lane's rebirth. The neighborhood had become a beacon of what a community could be when it rejected division. The Carters, the young black couple who'd moved in after seeing my story, hosted a barbecue that summer, their backyard overflowing with neighbors of every background. Mrs. Lee's solar panels had inspired a mini revolution, with Belmont Lane now generating more clean energy than it consumed. The Johnson's son, Michael, had expanded his coding workshops into a nonprofit, mentoring kids from across the county. Our monthly potlucks had grown into a cultural festival, with families sharing dishes from Nigeria, Mexico, Korea, and beyond. The Diwali celebration, once a target of Linda's complaints, was now the neighborhood's biggest event, with lanterns lighting up the street and kids of all ages joining in. I'd become something of a reluctant celebrity. My story had been featured in national outlets, from NPR to the Washington Post, as a case study in fighting housing discrimination. I spoke at conferences, sharing how documentation, community support, and sheer stubbornness could dismantle systemic bias. Universities invited me to guest lecture, and a documentary crew followed me for a week, capturing Belmont Lane's transformation. I wasn't in it for the fame, I just wanted to live in peace, but seeing my experience inspire others felt like a win bigger than any lawsuit. Chief Martinez's reforms had ripple effects beyond Belmont Lane. Her department's bias training and civilian oversight board became a model for other towns, and she was invited to testify before a congressional panel on police accountability. Ronald's case was cited as a textbook example of what happens when problematic officers are allowed to operate unchecked. The sensitivity training he and Linda had been forced to attend was, predictably, a failure. Rumors swirled that Linda had walked out of her final session, ranting about woke nonsense. But their refusal to change only highlighted the neighborhood's progress. Belmont Lane had moved on without them. One evening, as I sat on my porch, a new family pulled into the driveway at 1424. The for sale sign was finally gone, replaced by a small vegetable garden and colorful flowers. Maria and Javier Morales, a young couple from Guatemala, had bought the house, undeterred by its history. They stopped by to introduce themselves, bringing homemade tamales and a warm smile. "We heard about what happened here," Maria said, "but we also heard about what you did. This feels like a place we can belong." I thought about warning them about the neighborhood's past, about the ghosts of the Harisas, But then I realized that was the point of our fight, to create a place where such warnings weren't necessary. The Morales family settled in quickly, their garden becoming a neighborhood attraction. Kids played in the street, their laughter mingling with the chatter of parents on front porches. Mrs. Eleanor O'Connor, the retired teacher whose notes had helped topple Linda, started a book club that met at my house, where we debated everything from Toni Morrison to local politics. Dr. Sharma was elected HOA president, her data-driven approach ensuring fairness in every decision. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, old tensions occasionally surfaced, but we learned how to confront them head-on, with transparency and accountability. As I write this, I'm back on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun set over Belmont Lane. The framed cease and desist letter still hangs in my office, a reminder of how one morning's confrontation sparked a revolution. The Harises had tried to make me feel unwelcome, but their actions had backfired, creating a community where people like the Moraleses, the Carters, Mrs. Lee, and me could thrive. Their vision of a homogeneous, exclusionary suburb had crumbled, replaced by a place where differences were celebrated, not feared. Harold and Linda Harris had spent decades building a kingdom of intolerance, only to see it collapse because they underestimated the wrong person. Their legacy was a faded for sale sign in a neighborhood that had rejected their hatred. My legacy, I hope, is the opposite, a testament to what happens when you stand your ground, rally your community, and refuse to let bigotry win. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and I raise my mug to Belmont Lanamy neighborhood, our neighborhood, a place where tomorrow will always be better than yesterday. This story isn't just about one man's fight against a racist cop and his HOA enforcer Wi-Fi. It's about the power of standing up to injustice and the strength of a community that chooses inclusion over division. The Harises represent a mindset that still lingers in too many places, but Belmont Lane shows what's possible when people come together to reject it. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you faced or witnessed injustice in your own community? How did you respond? Do you think violence or harassment, like what the Harises unleashed, ever has a place in resolving disputes? Or is there always a better way? Share your perspective. Let's keep this conversation going and build a world where everyone feels like they belong.